We're going to take a look at how to set up user input in your Unity game. What we have here is just a basic setup with a single sprite. I called it Planet, and I used the Planet sprite that we used before. And over here, what we want to do is be able to access Unity's input manager. So we're going to go to Edit, and then Project Settings. And then you'll see here in Project Settings we have a lot of different tabs. One of these is called the Input Manager. Now I'm just going to attach my Unity project editor over here so that I have a sort of docked and so I don't lose it at some point, because sometimes it'll just go behind the other windows. And we're going to take a look for a second here to sort of see what's going on. What you'll see is that Unity defines what it calls axes for the different kinds of input that you can receive. And here we have one called horizontal, one called vertical, fire 1, 2, 3, all these different ones. You can read these. And this size here tells us how many different axes we can read from. What this is really is a way to generically refer to user input options. And so, if you have a controller or if you have some kind of pad, you can connect them all together so that they access the same name here. And in code, we're going to use these names, the word horizontal or the word fire1, for example, to refer to a particular axis. This also is important because, you might set up a controller scheme, but your controller scheme might not be accessible to all people. So you might assume that everybody can use a controller, but maybe they can't. And this allows you to create some sort of remapping from different kinds of controller schemes into the same name that you're going to use in your code. So if I wanted to move my character, for example, horizontally, I could use this horizontal axes, and you'll see that there are different fields that I can fill out, and then this will define like how that's actually going to work. In my code, I'm going to have to write something that's going to get the values out of this. Now, whenever any of these input kinds are used, so for example, let's take a look here. We have, of course, the name, but we have a positive and a negative button. And the positive and negative button indicate like what kind of value Unity is going to return from you. So generally you're going to see like a number between -1 and 1. So -1 for a negative value and a +1 for positive value, obviously. And then you can use that to multiply it by some kind of vector or some kind of value that's going to indicate how fast or how far your object is moving. All right. So that's the positive and negative version. And then these words right here indicate which key is being pressed. So left stands for left arrow, right stands for right arrow, and then A and D, these are alternative keys to be used. So for the WASD keys, these are going to be used right here. Okay. One thing to note about this is we define sort of like what kind of axis this is. So this is called an x-axis. And this means that when you move a joystick, it doesn't instantaneously get to the other from one side to the next. You actually move your thumb on it, and it's gonna get a value between 0 and 1. When it's in the center, it's 0, and so it's going to ramp up to get to 1 or ramp down to get to -1, depending on which way you moved it. So if I push the A key, which would be going left, then it's going to go from 0 to -1 over some amount of time. Well, that time is based on what is called the gravity, okay? And this gravity is going to determine how quickly it moves to get into that direction. The bigger the number you have here, the faster it's going to move. And the smaller the number you have here, the slower it's going to move. This dead sort of gives you a value that says it's not going to return any more values in case your joystick is slightly off. So if you use a controller and it's slightly off, then that's going to happen. Okay. So in terms of this horizontal input, we can also look over here and we'll see that there's a second horizontal. And this horizontal is going to be slightly different than the other horizontal. So this horizontal here, we see key or mouse button. That means when we press it. But here we see joystick axes. And so this is going to actually be from a controller input versus this horizontal, which is going to be from a key or mouse button. Okay. So generally you would set these up. You can add any number of these yourself by just changing this number. If I change it to 19, it's going to just create a new thing, and it's basically a new axis, and it's going to be, just duplicate the last thing that I had. And then I can change, how it's going to behave, what the input is going to be like, and then, what kind of value I'm going to get out of it. All right. This will make a little bit more sense. If this just seems a little bit daunting, we're going to use code and it'll make sense on how this all works. But for now, we're going to just use the horizontal and vertical names and just use their fields. Again, you can change these to be something more appropriate for your game. If you're in a 2D space game, horizontal and vertical don't really make sense. You might have like forward and aft and, those sorts of names for the different kinds of axes that you're going to use. So that's the input manager. Let's go back to our inspector and take a look at the planet that we're going to start moving. In order to do this, we need to add a script. So again, we're going to just go down here to new script, and we're going to give it a name. Oops, I didn't click. So I'm just going to call this user input generically. All right, so now we have the user input. And I'm going to take my user input and I'm going to move it into my folder, which is user input here, so that I have access to it. Then I'm going to double click on it and wait for Visual Studio to open and get set up. There we go. Oops. Here's my user input. So let's figure out how we're going to move this. First of all, we kind of like to have a movement speed. So in other words, how fast we move, just like we did before, in case we want to be able to control or customize how fast something is moving. So we're going to call this speed simply. And then we'll use that to multiply our actual speed that we're getting from our axis by that amount so that we know how far we're going to move. Okay. Then in every update, what we want to do is query for that movement speed. So we're going to use input, and then we will say get axes. Oops. Let's try to fix that. Axes. Okay. And then we have to give it the name, and this is where that horizontal name comes into play. Okay. So the question is, what is this going to return? Well, if I mouse over it, you'll see that it returns a float. And so I'm just going to be a little bit pedantic and just type out everything here. Normally you wouldn't have to type out, create all these variables or whatever. But just to make it obvious, this is reading in the axes value that we're getting. And then if we wanted to, just to make sure we're getting what we think we're getting, we can say something like do a debug log, horizontal axes, whoops, horizontal axes. Okay. Now, let's then multiply this by our speed, and we're going to add it to our position. Okay, so we're going to say game object. Well, we don't have to do that. We can just say transform dot translate, and we're going to create a new vector here. This is one of the many ways you can do it, and we're going to use axis times speed times delta time 0f 0f. Okay, and then this will cause it to move based on whatever my axis value is times the speed times the unit of time, so that our speed is actually measured in units by multiplying it by the time delta time. Okay, so this will set this up, and I'm getting a warning, and it says is never assigned a value and will always be 0. Yes, that is true. It's definitely going to always be 0, and that is because it's wasn't public, so it wasn't going to even show up in my interface. So I'm going to make that public. Then I'll wait for a second while it reloads it. It's going to pop it up here to be 0, and now I can go ahead and hit play at this point just to see what happens. And so I don't see anything happening, and if I use the A or the D keys or my arrow keys, you'll see that it's logging the value that it's getting from my axes. So -1 when I hit A and hold it, and +1, or as close to +1 as it can be. So this is what you got to watch out with floating point numbers. Okay, so let's change my speed to something like 1. This will let it move 1 unit. Okay. And now when I move my planet, what we'll see is that it actually moves left and right. you'll notice that it sort of slows down a little bit right at the end. And this is because, it's trying to act like a controller. So if I let go of the controller stick, then it would, pop back to the middle. But there's that small amount of time when it's going to be reading something that's non-zero. And because of the way I've written my code, it's going to keep reading those values. Okay. Now, if I didn't want it to just be that, like if I didn't want it to be a floating point value, that's going to be from -1 to 1, then I could read it as a button, right? And a button's going to give me something different. In order to do that, I'm just going to comment out this code here for a second. And I'm going to say input get button. Okay. And I'm going to use horizontal again. And if I look at what this returns, I'm going to see that it returns a bool value, right? So I'm going to have to get a bool value out of it. Okay, and now this is going to give me a true value if it was pushed, or a false value if it's not being pushed. And this will be read every time the input is read. It's going to give me that value out of it. Now that's going to change, of course, how things work here in my code, right? Because I can no longer use this axis. But what I could do is come up with a value. So I could say float axis equals pressed. So if it's pressed, then I'm going to give it a 1. Otherwise, I'm going to give it a 0. So this is what's called a ternary operator. And it's basically like an if statement that's an expression. And so if this is true, then it's going to return the first thing. Otherwise, it's going to return the second thing. Okay. And now axis is now an actual float. And so this will allow me to move. Now, the one thing that's going to happen is I don't have a negative version of this button. So I'd have to write another axis that would give me the negative version of that. So if I go ahead and hit run here, and then go ahead and change this to a 1 again, and then I press my A button, nothing happens. But if I come over here and push my right button, then it will definitely move forward. Of course, if I push my left button, it's going to move to the right also. And the reason is because there's no negative version of a button, like I said. So you're going to get the same thing out of it. And so that's how we do movement. You can, get everything from mouse movement, the mouse axes, and map them to the way your objects move, or your player moves, or various things like that. But hopefully this makes it fairly straightforward in setting up your input.